Next, item 3C on our agenda. This is County Planning Division, subtitle 25 update. We have Megan Reiser who's going to give the briefing, and we'll turn it over to staff. Take it away, Ms.
Good morning. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the board. My name is Megan Reiser with the Environmental Planning Section, here to provide a briefing on the upcoming Subtitle 25 update. Here with me today are Kim Finch, who is my co-lead on the project, as well as Tom Burke, Supervisor of the Environmental Planning Section, and Katina Scholars, our Countywide Planning Division Chief. Next slide, please. Updates to our local ordinances are needed to address the required program components mandated by the recently passed state bills, House Bill 723 and identical Senate Bill 526, known as the Natural Resources Forest Preservation and Retention Act. These bills require significant changes to our current code by July 1st, 2024. Next slide, please. In addition to updating Subtitle 25 to address the mandated requirements, we anticipate making additional revisions to address issues that have been identified over the years since our last major update, which was done in 2010. The changes will address Plan 2035 and the Climate Action Plan, clean up the code, and address the many interests within the county. Next slide, please. Today, we would like to discuss Subtitle 25, a brief history of the ordinances, provide an overview and summary of the mandated changes, discuss the impacts of the bill on the county, review the timeline, and identify next steps. Next slide, please. Subtitle 25 includes 3 divisions. Division 1 contains general regulations regarding trees and rights-of-way and is mainly implemented by the Department of Public Works and Transportation. Division 2 is the Woodland and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Ordinance that you may be most familiar with through tree conservation plans. Division 3 is the Tree Canopy Cover Ordinance that you may also be familiar with through landscape plans. We anticipate updates to both Division 2 and Division 3. Next slide, please. Prince George's County adopted a local woodland conservation program in 1989, effective January 1st, 1990. Prior to the state enacting the Forest Conservation Act in 1991, which required all jurisdictions to create and implement local programs by 1993. There have been updates to the state requirements over the years that we have adopted along the way, but our most recent overhaul of Subtitle 25 was done in 2010, which was when our local tree canopy cover requirements were enacted. Next slide, please. Actually, I think we're behind one.
Are you on the right slide, Megan? Is that good?
Next slide. Okay, great. Now I will outline the major changes mandated by the bills. An update to the forest replacement requirements is probably the biggest change. The goal of this requirement is for jurisdictions to show no net loss of forest. Actually, if you could go back a slide.
Is that the one?
No, the previous slide, slide 7. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. So the goal of the requirements is for jurisdictions to show no net loss of forest and to strive for an overall increase. The bills allow flexibility in how jurisdictions can approach this requirement. They outline the removal of woodland conservation thresholds for calculation purposes, and with some exceptions, requires one-to-one replacement. In other words, planting is to be provided an equal amount for woodland approved to be removed. Local jurisdictions may create their own programs to meet these requirements as long as it can be demonstrated that the county will achieve no net loss. Unless otherwise directed, staff anticipates implementing an alternative program as the state program is not a one-size-fits-all approach. We believe updating our current requirements will be sufficient to achieve no net loss while allowing us to consider the nuances of other local codes, programs, and plan goals. Our next steps will be to run scenarios across many different application types, including rural agriculture, single-family lots, commercial, multifamily, mixed-use projects. Under these evaluations, we will need to look at projects that are both large and small, wooded and unwooded, in order to get an accurate representation. Next slide, please.
There's a bit of a lag on our side, so take your time
Okay.
until the slide.
Okay, great. Another change involves planting requirements within stream buffers. The bills specifically call out intermittent and perennial streams for required planting. If the buffers are currently wooded, they are to remain wooded, and if they are not already wooded, they will be required to be planted. While this requirement for forested stream buffers would not technically involve an update to our local stream buffer regulations in the county, we plan to more closely evaluate the differences and see if there may be opportunity to marry the two requirements for practical implementation purposes. Next slide, please. Notification and public comments are brand new requirements. You are probably most familiar with tree conservation plans that accompany development review cases, but there are also what we refer to as standalone tree conservation plans. These are plans that are needed for permitting and are not required to go through the entitlement process. These plans are approved at the planning director level and then go straight to permit. The tree conservation plans that accompany development review cases have notice as part of their cases. However, we do not currently require any notice to adjacent property owners, nor do we have a process for public comment on standalone tree conservation plans currently. The bills outline certain criteria that trigger the new notice and public comment period, and we anticipate that the majority of plans will require both moving forward. Next slide, please. Written findings for clearing of priority forest is another new requirement. I'm sure you are familiar with the variance findings for the removal of specimen trees, and likewise the written findings required for impacts to regulated environmental features and primary management area in our local code. This process is anticipated to follow something similar to our PMA written findings for proposed impacts. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources is to provide the criteria for the written findings in an updated state forest conservation manual, and we plan to adopt accordingly. Next slide, please. An expansion of the already defined priority forest is included in the bills. I won't go into detail, but the added criteria are listed here for your reference. Based on preliminary mapping, priority forest covers the majority of the county and includes forests in all areas of the county, priority funding areas, centers, as well as rural areas of the county. Next slide, please. The bills require allowance for judicial review. You may be aware of some recent tree conservation plans that have been appealed. While appeals have been relatively few and far between, this would put some guardrails on the process. This also ties back to the notification and public comment component of the updates, and that the community should be more aware of proposed TCPs moving forward and will be required to petition for judicial review in a timely manner. Next slide, please.
Give us 1 sec.
There are some new exemptions from the program that should be noted, including stream restoration projects, stormwater management maintenance, forest management, and the construction of certain government facilities, such as the FBI building. Next slide, please. Grandfathering was included in the changes. Projects that are vested before the effective date may not be subject to the new requirements, and any revision to a plan or permit where the limits of disturbance remain unaltered also may not be subject to the new requirements. Next slide, please. And the last change we would like to outline for you involves woodland conservation banking. You may recall the state's Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021, which, among other things, halted the creation of off-site woodland conservation banks established with retention and only allowed the creation of banks using planting credits. The current bills allow for banks with retention credits to resume. However, there were some guardrails added to their use. Moving forward, only 50% of a site's requirement can be met with retention credits, and newly established banks using retention must be located in areas of priority forest. Next slide, please. We believe that the impacts of the bills on the county will have a very positive effect on the environment by furthering the goals of our local plan. However, there are anticipated challenges as well, including additional costs to all development within the county, as well as added program costs for implementation. Next slide, please. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources has been tasked with issuing procedures by which local programs will be evaluated for no net loss and for an update to the state's technical manual. We are on a very tight timeline for this proposed legislative update with an effective date of July 1st, 2024. Staff is recommending the alternative amendment option. If an alternative program is not adopted, then the new standard replacement requirements will need to be implemented by default. The goal of an alternative program is to demonstrate no net loss while allowing flexibility to address our local program goals, such as maintaining growth in our Plan 2035 centers. Next slide, please. Again, we are on a very tight time frame. This briefing is our first step to be followed by a briefing for the council and public and stakeholder engagement. We anticipate a bill being introduced by the council chairman at the request of the planning board in the February to March timeframe next year. And we will simultaneously be working on an update to our environmental technical manual so that once the legislation is passed and the new requirements are set, we will have the tools on hand to implement. Next slide, please. This concludes staff's presentation, and our team welcomes any questions you may have.
Great.
Thank you, Ms. Reiser. Nice job. Questions for staff? I have one. If we could, I'm sorry, go ahead, Will.
On slide, I think it was slide 7, there was an option for alternative program for reforestation, and you mentioned in the timeline that you all are developing out that option to alternative programs potentially. So what I wanted to ask about is something kind of different that we haven't thought about before in some cases. One thing that kind of occurred to me was, in our county where we have metro-oriented places, we're not going to have necessarily, like within the vicinity of certain developments, the ability to do the one-for-one replacement. So in the past, we've done like off-site developments and sort of other kind of donations to tree banks. What I was thinking about was more on the next slide, actually, on the alternative program on slide 8, where you're talking about the stream buffers. Because I noticed later on there was an exception for stream restorations, but it seems like everything is focused on physical trees that would be like the typical definition of sort of like vegetation. And if we go down to like Bladensburg, there's been a huge restoration of the watershed area around there with vegetation that's not terrestrial, like sitting on the land, but is aquatic and helping to clean up the river. And then we've also got into things that are non-tree or plant-based with like oysters and mussels kind of in the river. And for the first time in 50 years, in another week from now, people are going to be able to swim in the Anacostia legally, which I don't know if I would want to do that quite yet, but we're getting there. And it just sort of occurred to me, like, have you all thought about maybe in this alternative program some restoration of the aquatic plant life, or maybe cleanups of the streams, not just the buffers themselves, but like more looking at how we could do the actual rivers themselves. So if we're running out of space for the trees, then we focus in on other areas that might be impacted by projects or just make for nicer kind of like enjoyable usage of nature around our county.
So yes, so I guess the first point would be there will likely be lower thresholds in our centers. So like 1/4 to 1, 1/2 to 1, something like that. And then 1 to 1 outside of centers. That's something that we're looking at. Also for alternative credits, in the state bill, there were things established for stormwater management credits if the project is going above and beyond what is required by law, things like that. And there are also credits for individual trees. Tree canopy seems to be a big part of this bill. So we're still trying to figure out what would be appropriate to put in the woodland conservation ordinance and what would be appropriate to put in the tree canopy cover requirements, but to look at it as a whole project with water quality in mind, especially adjacent to these streams.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important that we think about that actively, and we're not just thinking about the trees, and we're not giving sort of a lesser requirement to more metro-oriented development. Like I want to see that development and certainly prioritize it, but maybe like if we have a lower requirement, it's not 1 for 1, then that's offset by offsite kind of improvements or assistance. Because like they're going to have to do stormwater management. They're going to have to do those things. And if they're going to be cutting down tree canopy in those areas, then having offsite but like very associated kind of like improvements would be useful. And I know that our rivers are really, the branches that feed into the Anacostia are extremely polluted. There's trash, like I go off the bike trails and we'll sit on rocks with my kids and like we throw rocks into the rivers and we watch the rivers. And I look around, there's like glass and there's plastic and other stuff around there and just not much vegetation or really like fish life and stuff or marine life kind of in those streams that certainly could be there. There's no reason why we couldn't prioritize that. And maybe we should think about a balance of being flexible and figure, and I don't know the exact way to write it down in codifying it, but having a balance of using aquatic or other marine life as offsets to the trees because they serve the same kind of purpose, even though if it's not the same thing, just in a slightly different way and can help improve our nature around here.
Mr. Dorn, this is Katina Scholars. We do, our current ordinance actually does have a provision for credit for habitat enhancement in lieu as part of meeting the woodland conservation requirement. And it has been very rarely used. And one of the reasons it has been rarely used because the credit isn't a one-to-one credit. It's a lower credit requirement. We will go back section of the code and to enhance it and give more clarity to it. And maybe it would encourage developers or applicants to use it more and possibly through the technical manual could give some examples. But we have to have a lot of discussion with DNR as to make it clear what can and can't be done for that. But we do have something there right now. I just wanted to, I had to give a nod to our current ordinance because that the update in 2010 really did open up the door to a lot of options of other options of meeting woodland conservation ordinance, and that was one of them. It's just that some of them are rarely used by the applicants. We just need to find a way to encourage them to use those other options more.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So yeah, if you can embark on those discussions with DNR to kind of figure out how do we encourage that, because that would be really nice to start to see. Just like a more well-rounded discussion of how we preserve our county and the environment around it that we cherish a lot.
Right. Thank you for that. I have a question. If you can go to slide 18, just a question about the timeline. And one of the items that you had was around from October to January, the stakeholder discussions. Can you give me a sense of the flavor of that when you say work with all interested parties? How is that going to proceed?
So we envision having meetings with the Maryland Building Industry Association, environmental groups, neighborhoods, things like that. Trying to get the word out, get an understanding of what the concerns are in the community and from the various viewpoints.
Right, because I mean, it's stating the obvious, but the more work that's done there, then when there's a bill introduced, it's going to be a bill that has all the appropriate folks already on board. That's the perfect world that we're aspiring to, I'm sure.
That is our goal, yes.
Right. So, and I wonder if there's perhaps if the commissioners and I could see what the sort of stakeholder engagement plan is, then we might have some thoughts about that, and we may be able to be helpful with it too.
Okay, great. Thank you. We will do that.
Sure. Appreciate that. Any other questions, commissioners? Okay, thank you all very much. This is just a briefing. The purpose of this was to talk through the changes and how the staff's going to proceed. I think you've done a great job explaining it to us, and we look forward to hearing more about it as you move along. Thank you very much.